Last week, the Central Powers made a breakthrough on the Italian front, so this week the Allies counter with a breakthrough of their own on the Palestine front. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Germans continued their operation of the Russian islands in the Gulf of Riga. Their combined offensive with Austria-Hungary smashed through on the Italian front. They were beaten by the French at La Malmaison, and they held their ground against the Canadians at Passchendaele. The Canadians were trying again this week, though. On October 30th, they managed to enter the ruins of Passchendaele, but were driven back with heavy casualties. They attacked at dawn, trying to take the red line positions not taken the 26th, and the blue line positions beyond as well. But the Bellevue spur that had frustrated the ANZACs loomed large. The Germans hung onto it with torrents of machine gun fire, but the Canadians took it, though they used up the attacking battalions in the process. Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry lost 80% of its officers and 60% of its men. The Edmonton Battalion on its left lost 75%. The attacks that day were also made worse by a shortage of drinking water. It was as hard to bring up to the front as artillery shells were, and the endless swamp of the battlefield had been poisoned by human waste and rotting bodies. But the Canadian Corps advanced a half-mile in spite of the heavy casualties. Commander Arthur Currie now had to bring up his 2 reserve divisions for his next attack next week. The British War Cabinet on November 1st updated its estimates of the cost in men of the battle. Losses for October alone were 110,000. They also pointed out, though, that in a quiet month, the Ypres salient would see 35,000 casualties. So the current offensive was only responsible for the extra 75,000. Only. At a conference addressed by British Commander Sir Douglas Haig, Alan Brooke wrote, "I could hardly believe that my ears were not deceiving me. He spoke in the rosiest terms of our chances of breaking through. I had been all over the ground, and to my mind, such an eventuality was quite impossible. I was certain he was misinformed and had never seen the ground for himself. But the army would try again next week." There was a breakthrough currently in progress, though, the Central Powers one on the Italian front. Italian Army Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna, when the attack had begun and turned into a breakthrough last week, had not issued rallying calls to his men, but issued blame, as usual, blaming everyone except himself for the collapse of the armies. Now, on the 27th, he ordered a general retreat. In the space of 4 days, the Central Powers had destroyed the Italian Second Army. On the 28th, the Austrians occupied Gorizia. The next day, the Germans captured Udine, former Italian headquarters, and by the end of the week, the Italian armies have retreated behind the Tagliamento River. Germany claims over 180,000 prisoners and 1,500 guns so far. The British Army also had big success this week, though, in the Middle East. On the Palestine front, where they had attacked and failed twice at Gaza so far this year. But now it would be a different attack. They had spent a 2-month campaign of deception aimed at convincing the Ottomans under Kress von Kressenstein that Gaza was again the target, including having false orders captured. A few weeks ago, right? A British officer had allowed Turkish guards to chase him from their guard post, and just as he escaped, he dropped a haversack smeared with horse's blood, so it looked like he had been wounded. The sack contained details of the next attack on Gaza and the impracticality of an attack on Beersheba. So now the British offensive against Beersheba under General Edmund Allenby kicked off October 31st. The Turks were totally fooled and suddenly saw 40,000 men bearing down on them. The first attackers to go into action were the New Zealand Mounted Rifles, but troops of the Australian Mounted Division, the 4th Light Horse Brigade, in spectacular fashion, launched a full-on improvised cavalry charge using sharpened bayonets as swords. See, aerial recon showed that the Turks had neither barbed wire nor anti-cavalry ditches. The 4th Brigade took over 1,000 prisoners. At a mile distant, their 1,000 hooves were stuttering thunder. They were an awe-inspiring sight, galloping through the red haze, knee to knee and horse to horse. Machine guns and rifle fire just roared, but the 4th Brigade galloped on. The last half mile was a berserk gallop with the squadrons in magnificent line. They plunged up the slope, the Turkish bayonets thrusting up for the bellies of the horses. We heard the mad shouts as the men jumped down into the trenches. A following regiment thundered over, and to a triumphant roar of voices and hooves was galloping down the half-mile slope right into the town. Beersheba had fallen. A much larger city was possibly about to fall as well, but to revolution. On November 1st, there was unrest in Petrograd as the Maximalists threatened armed action. Now, this was a radical wing of socialist revolutionaries, mainly active in the early part of the century. They got their name for demanding full implementation of the maximum socialization of the expected revolution. They also had a much more favorable view of terrorism than other revolutionaries, endorsing political terror, attacks on members of the government, expropriations, things like bank robberies, and economic terror, attacks on property or people like factory bosses. They were often compared to anarchists, though they rejected that comparison since they generally believed in a popular revolutionary dictatorship, rejecting parliamentary democracy in any form in favor of a secret, disciplined organization that controlled the general population. They had been nearly destroyed by arrests in 1906 and 1907 after the abortive 1905 revolution in Russia. And they weren't the only people making plans, though. Lenin had finally returned to Russia from his exile in Finland, clean-shaven and disguised with a wig and glasses, to now lead the Bolsheviks and plot the final downfall of the Kerensky government. Last week, the Bolshevik Central Committee had met and had voted 10-2 for an immediate armed uprising. They finally reached consensus for it to happen next week at the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. Russia's allies were certainly concerned about the possibility of the fall of the Kerensky government, which could lead to Russia leaving the war. In Britain, the Balfour Declaration was issued November 2nd. It was a letter from Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild that expressed Britain's support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The final discussions leading to the public declaration were partly about how it could be used to rally Russia's Jews to persuade their compatriots to continue fighting. But Colonel Alfred Knox, observing in Russia for Britain, had written in his diary, "There is evidently not the slightest hope that the Russian army will ever fight again." A British Foreign Office official, Ronald Graham, had written to Balfour last week, "Almost every Jew in Russia is a Zionist, and if they can be made to realize that the success of Zionist aspirations depends on the support of the Allies and the expulsion of the Turks from Palestine, we shall enlist a most powerful element in our favor." It was now arranged for 3 leading Zionists to go to Petrograd to rally Russian Jews to the Allied cause. The British Under-Secretary of State believed that the situation there could be restored by spring. But whether or not Russia would fight again, a newer ally was joining the fight in the field this week. On November 2nd, an American battalion took over from a French one at Pathé. This was the first time regular American troops had gone into action in the war. The next morning, one of their outposts was shelled by artillery and then raided by 213 Bavarians. This outnumbered the Americans 4-1, and 3 Americans were killed. 2 Germans were killed, and 1 deserted to the Americans, but the Germans took 12 American POWs. The rest of the Americans were found with white, drawn faces and haunted eyes. General John Pershing apparently wept when he heard of the attack. An inquiry included that the Americans were not fully trained and should be taken out of the lines. And we come to the end of the week. Canadians frustrated in Belgium, Australians and New Zealanders victorious in the Middle East, the Germans still breaking through in Italy, plans for a coup in Russia and for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Think about that American battalion taking over the line. I'm not certain if any training away from the field could really prepare you for the actual brutal reality of modern war. The world had never before seen such wholesale, impersonal, anonymous slaughter. There is one way, and one way only, to train for such combat. Experience it firsthand, day after day and month after month. Of course, this will involve the slaughter of tens of thousands of your men. But that's what's going to have to happen to really train those Americans. If you want to know more about the Americans that served in Europe but never returned, you can watch our special from the American Meuse-Argonne Cemetery right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Karen Eastman. Help us out on Patreon to make this show better and better, and you'll get cool perks in return. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.